24 minutes before 11 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. Looks pretty nice out there, actually. I think it's a little bit cool, but we're not going to complain. Most of the rest of the country is really going through some bad weather. We got pretty good weather right here. Ilan Wurman, is it the W pronounced like a V, Robin? And we'll find out in a second if I'm wrong or not. He is on the phone. He's an attorney. He's a non-resident fellow at the Stanford Constitutional Law Center and the former Deputy General Counsel on Senator Rand Paul's United States presidential campaign. And he's written a book. It's called A Debt Against the Living, An Introduction to Originalism, and we are going to learn a lot right now. I am a student at this point, and I'll continue to be a student even at the end of this conversation. Ilan, good morning, sir. How are you?
I'm fine. Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. And where are you right now? Where are you calling from?
I am still a practicing attorney in Washington, D.C., although I do have that appointment at the Stanford Constitutional Law Center. So I'm calling from D.C., the nation's capital. The swamp, some people call it.
So the first question is because you have two parts of your title that are both interesting. A Debt Against the Living. I can't wait to hear what that means. And an Introduction to Originalism. It almost seems like two different titles.
That's right. Well, there is a connection between them. So the title is taken from this letter that James Madison wrote to Thomas Jefferson. Everybody knows that Thomas Jefferson, or not everybody knows, but Thomas Jefferson's letter to James Madison is it's famous. He wrote it in 1789, and he said the following. Jefferson said that the earth belongs to the living. The earth belongs to the living and not to the dead. The dead have neither power nor rights over it. And Jefferson's letter today is often quoted for this idea that we shouldn't be bound by the dead hand of the past, by the dead hand of the Constitution. But what's less known is Madison's reply. Madison wrote back. And Madison's told Jefferson more or less, well, if the earth be the gift of nature to the living, then it belongs to them in its natural state only. The Constitution, Madison said, is an improvement upon the natural condition of the world, such that it forms a debt against the living, who take the benefit of that improvement. And the only way for we the living to faithfully discharge our debt to that improvement is through a kind of originalism. So that's where the title comes from, A Debt Against the Living. Who's right? Thomas Jefferson or James Madison? Does the Constitution create this debt against us? And does that mean we have to be originalists? So my book answers in favor of Madison, originalism, and the original Constitution.
Wow. Did everybody who lived back then have this kind of wisdom? Maybe TV has ruined us all. I don't know. I mean, it's amazing how much wisdom comes out of the people who founded this country.
I certainly agree that people don't quite talk or write like that anymore these days.
Yeah, I mean, just the ability to even come up with those kind of ideas and then express them in writing is pretty amazing.
It is, and I stumbled, again, at least in the constitutional literature, the political theory literature, Jefferson's letter is quite well known, and I was quite surprised when I stumbled upon James Madison's reply, in which he used this sort of elevated, beautiful, compelling language. And that's what my book tries to get at. Is he right in making that pretty incredible statement? So
correct me if I misunderstood, but it sounded like Jefferson referenced the earth and Madison referenced the world. And in my mind, the earth and the world are two different things.
Right, that's certainly true. I was paraphrasing Madison's letter. Madison said, if the earth be the gift of nature to the living, then their title can extend to the earth in its natural state only. The improvements made by the dead form a debt against the living, who take the benefit of them. That's what Madison said. So they were both referring to the earth, and it was a poor choice of paraphrase on my part.
No, it's okay. I thought maybe perhaps what Madison was saying is that in order for us, using the word world, that in order for us as a civilization to be more civilized, we had to build on things that people who preceded us put in place. The Constitution, the Constitution being one of them.
Yes, that is certainly true. And actually, Madison it's an interesting question because what you say is very astute, because it was argued that what they were doing with the Constitution was somehow rejecting the revolutionary principles, the exceedingly democratic principles of 1776. Remember, the Constitution was written 11 years later. The idea was to have a democracy, have a Republican form of government, but one that checked and balanced Republican passions and popular majorities and protected natural rights, as well as allowed for this sort of democratic government. So there was this argument that the founders in 1787 were somehow rejecting the principles of 1776. Now, I think that's wrong, but Madison has this very interesting passage in the Federalist Papers where he says, we owe a great debt to our revolutionary forebears of 1776, but the great genius of the Americans is that we look at the past, see where there are problems, and improve upon it. And so the question for us today is whether the Constitution should be rejected, just like the founders had to modify or reject the solutions of 1776, or whether they give us something that works. I mean, it could be either way, right? The Constitution still has to be defended today. And that's what I try to do in the book, make the case that the Founders' Constitution does everything a free Constitution has to do, even today, and it is still good and still binding and still creates this debt against the living.
And they did a fabulous, fabulous job crafting the Constitution. In my opinion, I don't think there is anybody today who has been elected to office that could craft another Constitution as brilliant as this one.
I'm in full agreement with that. I mean, it may not even be a perfect Constitution, but it's good enough, right, at what it has to do, which is a very difficult task. What does a free Constitution have to do for a free society? And this is the case I try to make in the book, what the founders thought. A Constitution for a free society had to principally balance the two competing ends of government. It had to create a regime of self-government on the one hand, where, we the people can govern ourselves through our elected representatives, decide what kind of society we want to be politically, morally, culturally, socially, economically, and so on. But it also had to protect a large measure of natural rights. And these are in tension with each other, because it's often popular democratic majorities that infringe on the rights of minorities. And so balancing these two things that are in tension is a very, very arduous and difficult task. And the founders, I argue, successfully balanced these competing objectives through ingenious mechanisms, like the separation of powers, checks and balances, the enumeration of powers, the division of federal and state powers, and so on. And it's remarkable, and I just don't think it can be replicated better today.
I don't see it either. Often when people would say things like it's a living, breathing document, and we had this period a few years ago, when you do a talk show, you're kind of part of all of this, whether you want to be or not. And so we were having this discussion about whether it's changeable, which is the living, breathing part of it, right? And if it wasn't changeable, then we would never have been able to do away with slavery. We would have never been able to... I guess we couldn't have had prohibition, and then we couldn't have undid prohibition. So that part makes it living and breathing. But what is your thought on that?
I think that's exactly right. There are three things one could say. When someone says, the Constitution, it has to be interpreted in a non-originalist way, in a living, breathing way, in sort of a progressive way, because it has to adapt to changing circumstances. There are three things to say. First is what you said, which is there is an amendment process, right? And when it comes to the most fundamental things about our constitutional order, we've used that amendment process. We've used it to end slavery. We've used it to grant women suffrage and so on. But the other thing to say is the founders weren't dummies, right? They wrote the Constitution in such a way that it would inherently be adaptable and flexible. It doesn't mean the meaning changes, right? But the application of the meaning changes. So the First Amendment, right? Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, right? It doesn't say Congress shall make no law affecting your right to write your thoughts with quill and parchment, right? It applies to the internet too, to speech on the internet. The Fourth Amendment, to be safe against unreasonable searches and seizures, applies to GPS devices put on that police officers put on cars. So the founders wrote these principles and standards and rules in such a way that it can apply to new factual and technological circumstances. And the final thing to say, if I may, I know I'm going on a bit long here, is our Constitution may be dead It may not be living and breathing, but our democracy is. The democracy our Constitution gave us is a living and breathing democracy. The founders knew that we would evolve and progress over time, and so they left so much to the democratic process so that we could evolve on things like gay marriage or abortion if you know you're a progressive. The point is, these were supposed to be fought out in the realm of democratic politics. So our Constitution may be dead, but I think our democracy is a living and breathing one.
The concept that our freedom is a God-ordained right, that we have the right to freedom. When I think about that, I try to apply it to everything because, just enter religion just a moment here. If I look into the sky, all the planets around, therefore, why would we be any different? If I look out into nature, all of the animals are free, so why would we be any different? However, squirrels are probably going to be eaten by some hawk somewhere. There's always going to be something that lives off of something else out in nature, and I often wondered about that part of what the Constitution expresses, that we are, it's a God-given right to be free.
That's right. So the founders in the Declaration of Independence said that we are endowed with our Creator, whether it's God or nature's God or just the state of nature, whatever it is. We human beings are created equal, and we can realize that sort of through reasoning about how man exists in the state of nature. Everybody's equally free in the state of nature. One man is as capable of killing another man, especially if that man is sleeping. So strength versus weakness are just differences in degree, not in kind. And if men are equal in the state of nature, this is the Lockean argument, why would men come out of the state of nature and form a civilized society in which one person had arbitrary rule over everybody else? Why would we give up our state of equal freedom in the state of nature and submit to the arbitrary rule of a tyrant? And they sort of use this reasoning to come to their conclusions that if we have these rights, these inalienable rights in the state of nature, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right, and to the use and dominion of property, one might add, then government must exist to secure those ends. Otherwise, why would we have ever gotten out of the state of nature?
Yeah, Ilan, first of all, let me just introduce you. Ilan, is your last name pronounced with a V sound or a W sound?
A W sound, okay. Ilan Wurman.
Ilan Wurman, okay. I think you fit right in with the Founding Fathers. Our notion that there's nobody alive today that could write this, I think you could. I've heard several speakers who probably could also. So there's probably nobody better to talk to than somebody who could have written this had you lived back then.
Well, I appreciate the compliment. I certainly don't, want to pretend that I would have been anything like as good as the founders. But I will say what I've tried to do is distill sort of their insights and wisdom into a short 135-page book. It's supposed to be short. It's an introduction to how to interpret the Constitution and what the founders intended to accomplish for the Constitution. It's intended to be fun and accessible to read. I'm told it is fun and accessible to read, and it's for a general audience. Anyone who cares about Justice Gorsuch and originalism and the direction of the Supreme Court in the coming years, and who wants to understand it. This book, I think, is for you and will help distill the founders' sort of thought.
And here's my thought every single time I hear any elected official speak. It's this, that when I go to a doctor, I can rest assured that he or she had to go through some kind of education, so he or she knew how to be a doctor. A lawyer like yourself, you had to study the law.
Yeah.
But somebody who's elected into office, the one thing that they vow to uphold is the Constitution, and they don't study it. It's amazing to me how they don't really get it. Now people will say Obama was a scholar, a constitutional scholar, and yet I don't know that you would disagree with a lot of his positions on things or not based on the Constitution, but it sounds like you do. And I'm not picking on him. I'm just thinking that and again, I'm not picking on Trump either. But I doubt that he understands the Constitution in any way near what you do.
Yeah, I certainly the ideal would be that the President of the United States would take seriously the Constitution and what it means and would study it, or at minimum, have people around him who take it seriously, him or her, who take it seriously, and who try to seriously control and advise the president. I don't think everything President Obama did was constitutional. I mean, there's obviously room for reasonable disagreement, and I would suspect that when President Trump, leaves, he will have probably pushed some limits. I don't know. It's a little early to tell, but that's why we need dedicated citizens to be vigilant and dedicated attorneys in the executive branch to not be afraid to say no to their boss, to the President of the United States.
Let me ask you if you could comment on one thing, and this is a little bit of an aside from your book, and I don't want to be unfair to the book, but since you are so knowledgeable about this, what are your thoughts on this? When it says Congress shall pass no law, does that automatically mean that the city council can't pass a law, or the school board can't pass a law? Or, you know what I mean? Like when they say you can't have the Bible in the school, well, the Congress didn't say you couldn't do that. The local school board said that.
Right. So that's a very astute and question. And so, as originally understood, the First Amendment only applied to the federal government. In fact, right, it says Congress shall not make an establishment of religion or a law respecting the establishment of religion.
Right.
Until 1833, the state of Massachusetts had an established religion. Right, and people forget that. So the First Amendment, as historically understood, didn't apply to the states. However, the 14th Amendment, which says that no state shall abridge the privileges or immunities of a citizen of the United States or deprive them of due process. Right? This has been interpreted to sort of incorporate the Bill of Rights, which historically only applied to the federal government, as against the states. So now it also applies to the states. But it's tricky. It's weird, right? How do you incorporate the First Amendment through the 14th Amendment to the states if it says Congress? Right, Congress shall make no law.
Right.
Well, for better or worse, probably for better, it's said to apply to the states. Whether the amendment itself, the requirements themselves, have been misinterpreted to preclude things like school prayer, that's a separate sort of question, and maybe the court's wrong about those. But that's at least how we get from Congress to the states. It's this weird history.
Right, and when it comes to the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, it seems like the states and the cities do make their own laws regarding that, and it does go against the notion that you have a right to bear arms. But at the same time, if it says Congress shall not affect that, then it doesn't affect you, right?
Right. So the Second Amendment, it's unlike the First Amendment, doesn't specifically refer to Congress, but it was historically understood to refer just to the federal government, just like before. This was incorporated actually pretty recently in a case called McDonald versus City of Chicago. I think it was in like '08, or maybe it was a bit earlier. This was a little, the court said that the Second Amendment applies to the states, so they can't infringe on our rights to keep and bear arms. But what does this mean? Reasonable regulations are allowed. Well, what's reasonable? Automatic weapons are maybe on one side, or semi-automatics on that side or the other. It's hard to say, but it certainly applies to the states today under this theory of the 14th Amendment.
When Justice Scalia died, a lot of people came out and gave him a lot of compliments and things. What touched you about him?
So Justice Elena Kagan said famously said that we're all originalists now. We're all textualists now. We all want to interpret the Constitution with its original public meaning or with what its text means. And she, again, Justice Kagan, appointed by President Obama, she credited Justice Scalia for that. And that's what I think is a tremendous accomplishment. Nobody was talking about originalism, textualism, taking the Founders' Constitution seriously in the 1980s, in the early 1980s, until Justice Scalia came around. And his legacy, and that's his legacy. He completely changed the nature of the debate.
Wow, it is fascinating. Let me just reintroduce you and mention the book and give people a way to read the book. Ilan Wurman is our guest. He's an attorney up in Washington, D.C., and he definitely understands the Constitution. He worked with Rand Paul. How was that, working with Senator Rand Paul?
It was terrific. I worked on his campaign in 2000, I guess when was it, 2015, and it was short-lived, as far as these things go. But it's always great working. I did some campaigning for Tom Cotton too. It's always great working for candidates who take the Constitution seriously and who take liberty seriously, and really will try to advance the Constitution in the modern world.
Yeah, and by the way, I think people like Rand Paul, Ron Paul, Ted Cruz, I think some of those guys could also write like that, like the Founding Fathers. I think they've got it all. They've figured it out too, and they teach us, as much as we can be. Let me. The book is called A Debt Against the Living. It's written by Ilan Wurman. Ilan, give us a website or some way we can get the book.
Sure. So it's on Amazon.com, and it's only $15 right now for the holiday season. Normally it's $20, $21, something like that. So you can get it for $15, only 135 pages. You could do it in 2 or 3 sittings. It's good for you, for friends who are interested in this kind of thing, and I hope it might inspire some readers about the founders and the Constitution and just sort of what a tremendous accomplishment they endowed us with.
Do you know one thing about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence is they're both really so relatively short. I mean, they're not like the healthcare laws that thousands of pages long. I mean, they really are, and they're really relatively easy to understand, even though the concepts are complex in them. And so it does deserve a little bit of thinking and a little bit of cerebral time. But when somebody like Ilan Wurman is your teacher, I think you're probably going to be better off as a result. Is that your hope? Is it your hope that we as Americans become better acquainted with the Constitution that is our foundation?
Yes, that's absolutely what I hope, and we often lament the lack of civics education, and my hope is that this book fills a gap for the general reader, the policymaker, the law student, the college student, and again, the general readers, so they can better understand, so we can all better understand that although the founders weren't perfect, for the time in which they wrote, their accomplishment was pretty spectacular, and it continues to be relevant today, and it continues to do what a constitution for a free society has to do, and it's worthy of our obedience and admiration for those reasons.
Do you know what I think was a stroke of genius was calling the head person a president as opposed to a king or anything else, because the president, the word preside is the root word. He presides. That's it. You preside over the government, which is truly you and I. You're supposed to be the government. And we're represented by that thing called Congress, and the president just presides over all of that. I think we've changed his role to be more king-like because they can have all these executive orders now. And I think that's a mistake. I think that makes the Founding Fathers roll over in their graves.
Mm-hmm.
That's right, and for a large degree, Congress itself is responsible because Congress passes really broad laws, and in implementing these laws, that gives so much discretion to the president and his or her administration to kind of make law through administrative rulemakings, right? And so Congress, in some respects, one might say, has abdicated some of its power to the presidency and making it more like a king. And I don't think we're quite that far, but sometimes it sure looks like that.
It's the checks and balances part of what they put together that keeps us from absolutely falling apart. Let's hope we have people like yourself who continue to remind us of what this country is and what made us who we are. Ilan, thank you for being on there. What a great conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, we'll be right back. This is WOCK Ocala.
Fox News Radio. I'm Chris Foster. It's being called an attempted terrorist attack.